Tea and tragedy at Willowmere Cottage. The garden of Willowmere Cottage was alive with the familiar hum of conversation and clinking china cups. The scent of freshly baked scones mingling with lilac and honeysuckle on a tranquil afternoon. In St. Mary Mead, Mrs. Honoria Greystoke's annual charity Needlepoint gathering was, without question, the highlight of spring social events in the village. The soft rustle of skirts and pleasant laughter drifted lazily through the flower-bordered lawns, where women sat in small clusters, embroidering floral patterns or elaborate scenes onto fine linen canvases. Jane Marple settled comfortably into a wicker chair beneath the shade of a flowering cherry tree, a delicate piece of needlepoint resting in her lap. Her soft, perceptive blue eyes discreetly observed the mingling guests as she listened to snippets of conversation floating her way. "You know, Cynthia," murmured Mrs. Edith Langston, leaning confidentially toward her niece, "I saw Eleanor." Mortimer slipped something rather secretive into her reticule when she thought no one was looking. "Mark my words, she's hiding something." "Oh, Aunt Edith," laughed Cynthia gently, dismissing the suggestion with a shake of her head. "You always imagine intrigue where there's none. Eleanor couldn't possibly keep a secret if her life depended upon it." Miss Marple's lips curved slightly at the exchange. She had long ago learned that secrets had a curious way of thriving precisely where no one believed them possible. At that moment, Honoria Greystoke herself emerged from the open French doors of her cottage, a vision of impeccable elegance in powder blue chiffon. Silver-haired and regal, she raised her voice just enough to gather attention. "Ladies, if I might have your attention, Mrs. Arthur Milton has graciously offered to judge our needlepoint contest this afternoon. She assures me she'll be utterly impartial," Honoria said with an indulgent smile. "I've placed all your entries in the drawing-room. Now please enjoy your tea." A soft ripple of applause acknowledged her announcement, and Mrs. Milton, a round-faced and cheerful woman of sturdy village stock, blushed modestly at the attention. She disappeared into the cottage, her broad hat bobbing. "Poor thing," sighed Miss Abigail Trent, setting down her teacup. "Imagine choosing among dear friends' handiwork. One risks being ostracized for life." The women laughed gently, but Miss Marple caught a slight twitch at the corner of Honoria Greystoke's mouth, a suppressed irritation, or perhaps anxiety. A curious response, given the triviality of the event. But then again, in Miss Marple's experience, seemingly trivial matters often cloaked darker realities. As the afternoon sunlight lengthened, the guests continued their needlepoint or ambled along the blooming flower beds. Miss Marple had almost finished a dainty rosebud when a sudden, piercing scream erupted from the cottage. Startled silence instantly enveloped the garden, followed by confused murmurs. A maid burst from the French doors, pale and trembling. "Oh, God, it's Mrs. Milton. She's dead." Needlepoints and teacups were abandoned as shocked villagers surged forward. Miss Marple rose slowly, her brow creased with concern, but her mind already assembling quiet observations. This was no mere tragic accident, she sensed it already. Something decidedly sinister had unfolded in the pleasant rooms of Willowmere Cottage. Inside, the drawing-room was frozen in unsettling contrast to the warmth outside. Mrs. Milton lay, sprawled awkwardly beside the large oak table, her eyes wide in blank surprise, her fingers still clutching a beautifully embroidered canvas. The needlepoint itself lay askew, the pattern curiously crooked as though hastily stitched by an uncertain hand. Honoria Greystoke stood, rigid and speechless, her gaze fixed upon the lifeless form. Miss Marple approached carefully, kneeling too, glanced briefly at the needlepoint before lifting gentle eyes to the anguished hostess. "Oh, Miss Marple," breathed Honoria, her composure slipping at last. "Why here? Why poor Mrs. Milton?" Miss Marple offered a sympathetic pat on Honoria's trembling hand, but her gaze drifted again toward the needlepoint, toward the uneven, distorted stitching that somehow seemed to echo the twisted tragedy that had just shattered the peaceful gathering. "Indeed," Miss Marple murmured softly, a thoughtful glint deepening her gentle eyes. "Why, indeed." Chapter 2. Whispered Threads and Shaken Teacups. The drawing-room of Willowmere Cottage had transformed from a place of genteel leisure into a chamber of dread. The needlepoint gathering guests stood in stunned clusters, their gloved hands twitching nervously at the sight of Mrs. Milton's lifeless form, still half leaning against the low table, as if she might simply rouse and declare it all a misunderstanding. But Mrs. Milton did not stir. Inspector Cray arrived within the hour, summoned hastily from Much Benham. He was a tall, stern man with a tidy mustache and the skeptical air of someone who had seen too many melodramatic reactions and far too few real crimes. He stepped into the room and surveyed the scene with professional detachment. "Well, then," he said after a long pause, "someone mind telling me what happened?" Honoria Greystoke, having regained some measure of composure, led the inspector aside and explained in halting detail the judging, the tea outside, the scream, and the discovery. Meanwhile, Miss Marple quietly remained in the background, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her eyes never idle. The inspector turned next to the maid, young Elsie Bickham, who wrung her apron in distress. I came in to bring the biscuits, sir," she stammered. Mrs. Milton was already on the floor. Her teacup was spilled on the table, and she looked terribly wrong. Cray grunted. "Wrong how?" Elsie blinked. "Her face, sort of frozen, and the needlepoint, it was all crooked, sir. It didn't look right, like someone else had tried to finish it." "Very well," he said, scribbling into his notepad. "No one heard or saw anything unusual before the scream?" "No," murmured Edith Langston. "We were all outside." "Miss Marple," Cray said, turning toward her, "you were seated just a few feet from the cottage. Notice anything out of the ordinary before the scream?" Miss Marple smiled politely. "Nothing terribly dramatic, Inspector. A bit of tension, perhaps." Honoria Greystoke seemed slightly anxious, but then again she's always very particular about these gatherings. "You mean the needlepoint judging?" "Yes, she's rather proud of her events, though, of course. She'd never say so, and selecting a winner can sometimes ruffle village feathers." Cray sighed and motioned toward the body. "Well, I'll leave the medical details to Dr. Fenwright. We'll know more soon enough. But I doubt embroidery politics are enough to kill someone." Miss Marple's smile deepened. "Oh, one would be surprised, Inspector. One really would." Outside the cottage, the villagers lingered in tight knots, gossip beginning to froth despite the horror. It rose like steam from a kettle, speculative, brittle, almost desperate in its desire to understand and assign blame. "I bet it was something." "She ate," declared Mrs. Simpkins. "She always did overdo the lemon curd." "Oh, nonsense!" replied Reverend Ellicott, adjusting his spectacles. She looked startled, not ill. I'd wager a fright did her in. She was in her 60s, you know. She was 58, corrected Miss Abigail Trent, and not prone to fainting, if you must know. This was something deliberate, mark my words. Meanwhile, Miss Marple stood quietly near the hollyhocks, speaking gently with Cynthia Langston. You knew Mrs. Milton fairly well, I believe? Cynthia nodded. She helped me with my garden last spring. Very kind woman, very honest. A bit opinionated when it came to fabrics, oddly enough. Oh, she once told me she could always tell when someone used inferior thread. It phrased the character as well as the cotton, she said. How intriguing, murmured Miss Marple. Still, Cynthia added, her brow furrowing, I don't see how judging needlepoint could have led to this. It's all just for charity, really. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the drawing room window where she could just make out the corner of the oak table and the abandoned tea service. Charity, yes, she said, but also pride. And pride, dear Cynthia, is a very curious motivator. It disguises itself so well, under helpfulness, under tradition, even under kindness. Back inside, Dr. Fenwright had finished his cursory examination. He spoke in hushed tones with Inspector Cray. No signs of trauma, he said, but her lips show a slight bluish tint. I'd hazard a guess at poisoning. Something quick. Could have been in the tea. Cray frowned. We'll need to test the cup. The tea service was promptly collected, along with the needlepoint that lay crooked and unfinished beside the body. It was a lovely design, a row of daffodils stitched against a spring meadow, but the final stitches slanted awkwardly, as if done in a rush, or by someone not used to stitching at all. That evening, the village of St. Mary Mead lay hushed beneath a dull gray sky. Rain threatened, but never fell, as if nature itself held its breath. In parlors and kitchens, conversation turned again and again to the tragedy. At the vicarage, Reverend Ellicott muttered something about modern wickedness. At the inn, Mr. Jeffers, the publican, declared it was a clear-cut case of jealousy, probably over the prize. And at the Langston residence, Edith declared over supper that Eleanor Mortimer had the look of someone with something to hide. But Miss Marple, seated in her rose-patterned armchair by the hearth, simply stirred her tea in slow circles and thought. She was not yet ready to form conclusions, but a few things already struck her as peculiar. Mrs. Langston leaned in. But wouldn't poisoning require planning? I can't see Eleanor managing something so delicate. Abigail sipped her tea. She has a niece who studied chemistry. That counts for something. At the back of the tea-room, a man coughed softly into his napkin and stood. It was Mr. Lionel Shapley, the retired solicitor who had taken to long, solitary walks since his wife's passing the year before. He gave the women a tight nod and exited quietly. They watched him go with vague suspicion. He brought Mrs. Milton a slice of cake once, didn't he? Edith asked, squinting through the window. 2 slices, Abigail confirmed. And a sprig of rosemary. That's practically a proposal in some circles. Meanwhile, Miss Marple was finishing a polite cup of tea with Cynthia Langston on the latter's veranda. The 2 women sat in calm companionship, watching sparrows dart through the hedges. They're saying Eleanor might have done it, Cynthia offered, her voice soft with unease. But I don't believe it. She may be prickly, but poison. can't see it." "No," said Miss Marple, "neither can I, though it's very tempting to focus on the most disagreeable person in a group. We mistake personality for motive far too often. One must remember that being unpleasant is not the same as being capable of murder." Cynthia looked thoughtfully into her teacup. "Do you think it was the tea, then? That someone slipped something in her cup?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Or perhaps in something else entirely. You see, my dear, when one listens to villagers speak of a tragedy, it's rather like listening to a badly tuned wireless static distortion and the occasional moment of startling clarity." "And has anything sounded particularly clear to you?" Miss Marple tapped her fingers lightly on her saucer. "Just this, that Mrs. Milton was seen entering the drawing-room alone, that no one noticed anyone else go in, and yet someone must have, because someone stitched the last crooked line on her needlepoint, and it wasn't her." Cynthia blinked. "So it was done after she died?" "Or as she was dying," said Miss Marple, her voice quiet. "Either way, it was not stitched by her hand, which suggests our killer wanted us to think she had completed the piece. But why go to that trouble?" "That," Miss Marple said with a thoughtful smile, "is the sort of question one must tuck away and let steep, like tea." At that moment a bicycle bell rang out from the road beyond the hedge. Young Henry Goss, the postman, trundled by, cheerfully calling out, "Afternoon, Miss Marple. Delivered one for you this morning. Bit of a mystery, it was." Miss Marple tilted her head. "Oh?" Envelope had no return address. Just said to Miss Marple, urgent. Left it with the rest. After finishing her tea, Miss Marple returned home and found the envelope on the hall table. The handwriting was a nervous scrawl. Inside was a single piece of paper, torn hastily from a notebook. It read, "I think I saw something, but I don't. Know what to do. Meet me at the churchyard after dusk. Please come alone." It was unsigned. Miss Marple folded the note carefully and placed it in her writing desk. She had received notes like this before, not often, but enough to recognize the tone of someone both frightened and uncertain. Dusk arrived in a misty veil, and Miss Marple, with her shawl draped over her shoulders, made her way down the narrow path behind the vicarage. The churchyard was quiet, except for the rustling of leaves and the gentle creak of the iron gate. She waited near the old yew tree, watching the gravestones catch the fading light. At precisely 7:10, a figure emerged from behind the bell tower. It was Elsie Bickham, the maid from Willowmere Cottage. Her face was pale, and her eyes darted nervously. I didn't want to speak in front of the inspector," she said. "I'm just a maid, and people never believe girls like me." Miss Marple gave her a kind look. "But I shall believe you, my dear, if you tell me what you saw." Elsie swallowed. "It wasn't much, but just before I found her, I passed by the back hallway. I saw a shadow slip through the pantry door. It wasn't Mrs. Milton. I think it was a man, tall, moving quietly." "A man?" Elsie nodded. "I didn't think anything of it then. Just thought maybe the butcher had come early, but after what happened, I remembered. There was no one supposed to be in the house." Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on the girl's trembling fingers. "Thank you, Elsie. You've been very brave." As Elsie left, Miss Marple remained in the twilight, her thoughts turning. A man, a shadow, and a needlepoint suddenly crooked as if someone unfamiliar had tried to pass it off as complete. And most curious of all, the winner of the needlepoint contest had yet to be announced. Chapter 4. First Suspects. The next morning began not with birdsong or the usual clatter of breakfast crockery, but with the solemn toll of the church bell. It rang once, twice, and then fell silent, its sound meant not for celebration, but remembrance. Though no official announcement had yet been made, the villagers had already decided. Mrs. Milton's death was not natural, and the person responsible was still walking among them. Miss Marple, as was her custom, readied herself early. She selected a plain gray coat and her most unassuming hat, a wool one with a slightly wilted ribbon. She knew from long experience that people confided more freely when they forgot they were being observed. At precisely 9, she arrived at Willowmere Cottage, now under temporary watch by Inspector Cray and his young constable, Edwin Patch. Small sign on the gate read, "No visitors until further notice." Miss Marple, of course, stepped inside with a nod to the constable, who had once been a chore boy under her late nephew. "I've come to return a book to Mrs. Greystoke," she said sweetly, holding up a worn copy of Cranford. "So sorry about the timing." Inside, Honoria Greystoke looked pale but perfectly composed, her silver hair pinned with more care than usual, and her morning dress a careful shade of regretful lavender. "Oh, Jane," she said, ushering her in, "how kind of you. I confess, I haven't slept. Everything feels so exposed, as if all the years we spent building quiet lives could be overturned by one terrible afternoon." Miss Marple nodded. Death has a way of rearranging what we thought was certain, even more so when it chooses such an unusual time and place. Honoria exhaled through her nose. "The inspector's been asking all sorts of questions. About the entries, about the tea, even about the linens we used. As if I would poison someone with my own sponge cake. I don't suppose he asked about the judging process?" Miss Marple offered lightly. "Only everything," Honoria said, her tone prickling faintly. "He wanted to know who touched." "Which pieces?" "I told him what I told everyone. I gathered all the entries myself and placed them on the long table in the drawing-room. I locked the room until Mrs. Milton arrived to judge them." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "You locked it? But of course. You know how some of the more competitive ladies can be. I didn't want any tampering. Quite right, and the key?" Honoria's eyes faltered for the briefest moment. "I had it in my apron pocket. I handed it directly to Mrs. Milton, just before she judged. Yes, around 3:15, she went in alone. I returned to the garden to prepare for the announcement. It was meant to be a charming little moment, but no one else was seen entering the house, not that I'm aware." Miss Marple said nothing further, but in her mind a small thread tugged loose. If the room had been locked until Mrs. Milton entered, and no one was seen going in after her, then how? Had someone followed or been there already? As she left, Miss Marple passed Constable Patch again. He gave her a subtle nod. "Inspector's drawn up a list of potential suspects," he murmured. "Says he's starting interviews this afternoon." Miss Marple paused. "And who's on that list?" Patch glanced around. "Top 3 are Eleanor Mortimer, Mr. Lionel, Shapley, and young Verity Lyle." "Verity?" Miss Marple blinked. "That's unexpected. She had the needlepoint piece closest to Mrs. Milton's in style," Patch explained. and she's new in town. People get suspicious of new faces. Ah, Miss Marple said softly. Yes, people do. By noon, Eleanor Mortimer had been summoned to the constabulary's temporary office, a side room in the village hall. She arrived wearing dark green and a stubborn expression. Her gray curls were pinned back in tight coils, and her mouth was set like mortar. "I'll have you know," she told Inspector Cray before he'd asked a question, "that I would rather have swallowed a hedgehog than murdered someone over embroidery." Cray blinked. "Mrs. Mortimer, we're simply trying to establish who had motive or opportunity. My motive, apparently, is that I'm unpleasant," she snapped. "If that's a crime, half this village belongs in the tower. Did you see Mrs. Milton enter the drawing-room?" "I saw her go in, yes, around the time the cucumber sandwiches came out." "I didn't see her come out." "And you?" "I stayed in the garden. I had a particularly difficult stitch to finish." Cray made a note. "And did you have any disagreements with Mrs. Milton recently?" "She thought my needlepoint lacked subtlety," Eleanor said through clenched teeth. "But I wasn't about to poison her over it." "Did you win last year?" "No, Mrs. Langston did. She's smug about it to this day." Cray dismissed her shortly after, rubbing his temples. "She's combative, but seems genuinely annoyed by the accusation," he told Constable Patch. "Still, keep her in the file." Next was Mr. Lionel Shapley, who arrived looking weary and uncomfortable, his spectacles askew and his tie slightly crooked. "I didn't even submit anything," he said nervously. "I only attended to deliver a check for the charity. I didn't know anyone had died until I heard the scream." "Why were you in the house?" "I wasn't, but the maid mentioned seeing a man near the pantry." Lionel faltered. "I did go inside briefly to find the lavatory. I didn't see anyone. Didn't even know Mrs. Milton had gone in." "Why not use the garden one?" He flushed. "I didn't want to queue with the ladies." Cray raised an eyebrow. "You didn't go near the drawing-room?" "No, I swear." Cray let him go, but marked his name with a red dot. "Too nervous," he muttered, and lying about something. Finally came Verity Lyle, the youngest of the contestants, barely 20, with a quiet demeanor and shy eyes. She had moved to the village only a year prior with her mother, a widow from Dorset. "I didn't know Mrs. Milton well," she said softly, "but she complimented my stitches once." "Did you enter the contest to win?" "I entered to feel part of something." "Did you go inside at any point?" "No," she whispered. "But I saw someone else." Cray leaned forward. "Who?" "She hesitated. I'm not certain. I thought I saw Mr. Shapley near the kitchen door, just for a moment. He looked lost." Cray scribbled furiously. When the interviews were complete, he gathered the notes into one folder and locked them in the drawer. Miss Marple, seated in the garden with her knitting, didn't need the folder. She had already begun stitching the pieces of truth together. Chapter 5. A hidden clue. The village of St. Mary Mead had developed a curious rhythm in the days following the tragedy. Children whispered ghost stories about poisoned teacups. Shopkeepers lowered their voices when customers mentioned Mrs. Milton's name. And people who had long considered themselves good friends found themselves scrutinizing one another across hedges and bakery counters. Miss Marple, however, was not scrutinizing. She was sifting. It was on a bright Wednesday morning, with the scent of cut grass and drying laundry in the air, that Miss Marple paid a quiet visit to the village hall. The constabulary had returned most of the contest submissions to their respective owners, but a few those entered by deceased or suspected. Individuals remained under polite but firm lock and key. Miss Marple, of course, had a way of opening doors without keys. She arrived just as Constable Patch was stepping out, a paper bag of carrot buns in one hand. "Oh, Miss Marple," he said, surprised but polite. "Looking for someone?" "Actually," she said sweetly, "I was hoping to take one last look at the Needlepoint submissions." "A matter of personal curiosity." Patch hesitated. "Inspector Cray's not keen on people poking about." "But I assure you," said Miss Marple, with that gentle firmness she reserved for moments of importance, "I never poke. I observe, and I have excellent memory for threads." The constable relented, unlocking the small side room where the surviving entries lay on a long folding table. Each piece rested atop a white linen cloth, tagged with a paper label bearing the entrance name in tidy ink. Miss Marple moved slowly, her hands behind her back, scanning each work with quiet intensity. There were delicate floral wreaths, pastoral scenes, a few valiant attempts at biblical imagery, and then there it was. Mrs. Milton's final judging piece. The needlepoint design was simple. Daffodils clustered beside a cottage gate, but the last two rows were slanted, uneven rushed. The threads dipped oddly on the right edge, as though the tension had changed mid-stitch. To someone unfamiliar it might seem like a mistake in judgment, but to Miss Marple it was a shift in intention. She leaned in, inspecting the back of the canvas. "That's where the real story always lived." "Yes," she whispered, almost to herself. "That's what I thought." "What is it, miss?" Patch asked, stepping beside her. She straightened slowly. "Look here. See how the knot changes? The final row begins with a different anchoring stitch than the rest." "I wouldn't have noticed," Patch admitted. "Most wouldn't, but this one is what I call a schoolgirl's knot. Sloppy. Pulled through too thick. Mrs. Milton was a perfectionist. She'd have clipped and redone it. Someone else added this final row. You think the killer tried to make it look like she finished the piece?" "I do," said Miss Marple. "And I think they stitched more than just thread. They stitched their panic." Patch frowned. "Why would they go to such trouble?" "To complete the illusion," Miss Marple said. "Imagine if Mrs. Milton were found slumped over an unfinished needlepoint. It might suggest someone interrupted her. But a finished piece? That implies finality, that nothing happened until the task was done. It shifts the timeline. Clever, in a way." "Clever and foolish," Patch muttered. "And you're sure it's a man's hand?" "Not necessarily," Miss Marple said, tapping her chin. "But certainly not hers. Which means the person was either present when she died or entered immediately after. That short window of time becomes very interesting." Patch nodded. "I'll let the inspector know." Miss Marple gave a faint smile. "Do, but perhaps wait until I visited one more person." An hour later, Miss Marple stood on the threshold of a small red-brick cottage at the end of Windle Lane. The garden was overgrown, but hopeful, with pots of marigolds and mint trailing down from the window-sills. Verity Lyle opened the door with surprise, written all over her face. "Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting visitors." "I hope I'm not imposing, dear. I find myself suddenly curious about daffodils." Verity blinked. "Daffodils?" "Yes. needlepoint daffodils to be precise. I wondered if I might see your contest entry again, just to admire it. I remember it had a lovely border. Flustered but polite, Verity invited her in. The sitting room was neat, sparsely furnished, with one corner serving as a small embroidery station. Her needlepoint submission lay folded on. The side table dot, Miss Marple examined it with admiration. Such a tidy finish, clean anchors, consistent thread, tension. May I? Verity nodded. Unsure, Miss Marple flipped the canvas gently, inspecting the back. "Mom," she murmured. "Now, this is what Mrs. Milton would have called a professional back. No chaos." "I did try to make it perfect," Verity said softly. "I used to stitch with my mother. She said the back should be as neat as the front." "How wise," Miss Marple said. Then, turning to the girl, "Forgive me, but may I ask something a touch improper? Where were you between 3 and 4? That afternoon?" Verity's eyes widened. I was outside, near the petunias. I spoke with Mrs. Trent for a bit." "Why?" "Only because the window beside those petunias offers a very clear view into the pantry hallway." A long silence followed. "I didn't mean to lie," Verity whispered. "I just didn't want to get involved. But I did see Mr. Shapley come out of the pantry. He looked flushed. His collar was undone. Did you see him go in?" "No, only out. But he was holding something. A handkerchief, I think." Miss Marple pressed her lips together in thought. "Thank you, dear. You've been most helpful." That evening the sun dipped low over the hills, casting long shadows across St. Mary Mead. Inside her cottage, Miss Marple sat with her knitting. In her lap and her thoughts spinning faster than her needles, there was a man who'd been seen where he claimed not to be. A piece of needlepoint finished by hands not belonging to the victim, and a cup of tea left untouched, yet spilled across the judging table. "Someone made a mistake," Miss Marple murmured into the silence. "A small one, but one that matters." Her eyes fell again on the note she'd received from Elsie. A line returned to her. "I think I saw something, but I don't know what to do." But it wasn't what Elsie saw that mattered now, It was what someone else had failed to hide. Chapter 6. Confrontations and secrets. The village green had never felt so heavy with glances. Children no longer played freely. Dogs were kept on shorter leashes. Even the usual clatter of teacups in the café had turned subdued. In St. Mary Mead, gossip had always served as both entertainment and economy. But with a murder clouding the lanes, words took on weight, and every silence carried a question. "No," Eleanor said dryly. "She never approved of anything I did. Too bold, too loud, too opinionated." "Still," Miss Marple said, watching her closely, "you entered the contest." "I wanted to win. That doesn't make me a murderer." "Of course not," Miss Marple said, rising. "But it does mean you cared more than you let on. Thank you for your honesty, Eleanor." As she left, Eleanor called after her, "If you're looking for secrets, Jane, don't forget that some are embroidered into people, not just fabric." Next, Miss Marple walked to the inn, where Lionel Shapley had taken to dining alone since his name had surfaced in whispers. She found him seated in the corner, sipping weak tea and tearing his toast into quarters. "Mr. Shapley," she said warmly, "might I sit?" He nodded, eyes wary. "I understand you used to work in law," she began. I imagine you developed quite the instinct for lies." Shapley offered a bitter smile. "And for silence, Miss Marple. Some truths are more dangerous when spoken." She sipped her tea. "You were seen near the pantry door the day Mrs. Milton died." His face twitched. "Only because I was lost. I told the inspector. But you didn't tell him you'd been in the drawing room before Mrs. Milton." "I wasn't," he said, too quickly. Miss Marple leaned in slightly. "Mr. Shapley, did you know Mrs. Milton before she came to St. Mary Mead?" He blinked. "I wondered," she continued, "because I recently learned from Honoria Greystoke that Mrs. Milton wasn't always Mrs. Milton. Her maiden name was Arlette Dunbridge." Shapley paled. Miss Marple continued gently. "You represented her husband once, didn't you? In a property dispute that ended badly." "She lied under oath," Shapley said, the words spilling now. "Destroyed a man's livelihood. I resigned afterward. Left the city. She saw me at the gathering and smiled as if I were some pleasant old fool. You didn't want to harm her, did you?" He shook his head, eyes glistening. "Only to forget her. But I didn't poison her, Miss Marple. I didn't go near the tea." "Then who did?" she asked softly. "I wish I knew." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple visited Verity Lyle once more. The young woman opened the door with a hesitant smile. "I was just finishing my new project," she said. "After everything that's happened, I thought stitching might help me think." "Stitching always does," Miss Marple agreed. Stepping inside, Verity's new canvas was a landscape rolling hills and a small lake. The stitches were even, the colors soft. Yet something about the pattern struck Miss Marple as familiar. "May I ask where you found the design?" she asked. "It was in one of Mother's old pattern books," Verity said. "She collected them before she died." "I see," Miss Marple murmured. "How long have you been in St. Mary Mead?" "Almost a year. We moved after my father passed. Mom didn't want to stay in Dorset. And Mrs. Milton? I never met her until the contest. Honestly, I hardly knew anyone when we arrived." Miss Marple studied the young woman's careful stitches, the patience in her posture, the steadiness of her hand. Not a trace of panic, not a single unraveling edge. "I believe," Miss Marple said gently, "that you saw more than you told." "The inspector." Verity's hands froze. "I don't mean to accuse," Miss Marple continued, "but I do believe you saw someone leave the drawing room that day. Not the pantry, not the garden, the drawing room." Verity didn't speak at first. Then, slowly, she nodded. "I was afraid. I wasn't sure what it meant." "Who did you see, dear?" Verity looked down at her lap. "It was Honoria Greystoke." Miss Marple blinked. "Honoria? She told the inspector she was outside. But I saw her come out of the drawing room just before the scream. She had something in her hand. A folded cloth, I think." Miss Marple stood. "Thank you, Verity. That helps more than you know." That evening, a quiet knock came at the Greystoke residence. Honoria opened the door to find Miss Marple, her expression unreadable. "I've come with a few thoughts," Miss Marple said. Honoria hesitated, then stepped aside. "You may as well come in." The drawing room, though recently dusted, still felt shadowed. The spot where Mrs. Milton had fallen was empty, but Miss Marple's eyes fell there with quiet precision. "I believe someone tried to shift the timeline of the murder," she said, "to make it seem that death occurred later than it did. And someone with a deep investment in keeping order and reputation intact. Honoria's voice was brittle. "Are you accusing me?" "I'm observing," Miss Marple said, her voice soft. "And what I observe is this. The room was locked until the judging. Mrs. Milton was found dead, but her needlepoint had been finished after death. Someone tried to maintain a story of control, of respectability. But the truth always unravels eventually." Honoria's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her brooch. "You've no proof?" "Not yet," said Miss Marple. "But people talk, and threads fray, and sooner or later someone will tug the final stitch." She rose to leave. "Good evening, Honoria." And in the silence that followed, only the soft tick of the grandfather clock remained. Chapter 7. Another twist the next morning. St. Mary Mead was shaken by news that traveled faster than any post or bell could deliver. A second incident. Elsie Bickham, the young maid who had first discovered Mrs. Milton's body, had been found unconscious in the pantry of Willowmere Cottage. She was breathing, but only faintly, and a broken teacup lay shattered at her side. Her lips were pale, her pulse erratic. Dr. Fenwright, called immediately to the scene, declared it suspiciously familiar. "She's been poisoned," he said grimly. "Same symptoms. If she'd drunk any more, we might be attending another funeral." Inspector Cray, now irritable from sleepless nights and mounting pressure, stood in the pantry with his hands on his hips. "Well, this changes things. Either the killer panicked and tried to silence a witness, or we have someone more ruthless than we thought." Miss Marple arrived shortly after, having heard the news from a breathless Cynthia Langston, who had sprinted to her house in her gardening apron. "She found a second teacup," Cynthia whispered, as Miss Marple tied her shawl. "Can you believe it? Another one? Elsie must have been snooping." Miss Marple didn't comment. She had her own ideas about Elsie Bickham and what, or who, she might have stumbled upon at Willowmere Cottage. The inspector greeted her with wary relief. "You've got good instincts, Miss Marple. I'll admit that much. I suppose you'd like to poke around again?" "I prefer to think of it as tracing threads," she said serenely. "May I see the teacup?" It had already been secured in a small evidence tin, but Miss Marple was permitted to inspect it under supervision. The china was the same delicate pattern used during the gathering, a floral rim with fine gold edging. But this cup, unlike the others, had a faint dark ring at the bottom. A residue, perhaps. "Has the tea been tested?" she asked. "Sent to the lab," said Cray, "but it'll take a few days. May I see the rest of the set?" Cray led her to the locked kitchen cabinet, where the remaining teacups were stacked neatly. She examined them, comparing handles and rims. All matched, except one. "This one," she said, pointing to the far right cup, "has a different pattern inside the rim. See? No gold fleck, and a hairline crack across the saucer." Cray looked closer. "Well, I'll be. You think the poison was meant for someone else originally?" "Perhaps," said Miss Marple, eyes narrowing. "Or perhaps the cup was introduced intentionally, a decoy." They were interrupted by the sound of someone clearing their throat behind them. It was Reverend Ellicott, hat in hand, his brow lined with worry. "Forgive me," he said, "but I thought you should know Elsie has regained consciousness. She's very weak, but coherent." Miss Marple's eyes lit with quiet urgency. Then I believe it's time to visit her. At the vicarage infirmary, Elsie lay propped against pillows, her face drawn but alive. Her hands clutched a blanket that trembled as she breathed. Miss Marple approached gently, taking the girl's hand in hers. "You were very brave, my dear." Elsie looked up, her voice a rasp. "I didn't mean to. I wasn't snooping. I remembered something. Miss Marple patted her hand. "You've done very well, my dear, and you've given us what we need." Outside the room, Inspector Cray was scribbling furiously. "A pen? Gloves? Sounds like someone went to great lengths." "Yes, Miss," Marple said, "but mistakes multiply under pressure. The question now is who owned that handkerchief and who wanted it hidden." By late afternoon, Miss Marple returned home to reflect. A handkerchief with blood, a substituted teacup, a poisoned maid. Someone was trying to keep control of a narrative already unraveling. She placed her knitting aside and turned to her bureau. Drawer. Inside was a small notebook, barely used, containing notes taken since the garden party. On one page she had written a single phrase: "The crooked needlepoint tells 2 lies." The first lie she had already deduced. The needlepoint had not been completed by Mrs. Milton. The second, she now understood, had to do with the competition itself. That no winner had been announced, but someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to suggest that Mrs. Milton had chosen a piece, finished her judging, and then died peacefully at the table. Why? To delay suspicion, to appear innocent, to protect an identity until an escape could be arranged, perhaps, or worse, to reclaim something taken long ago. Miss Marple reached for the telephone and rang the vicarage. "Cynthia," she said softly, "would you be so kind as to meet me at Willowmere Cottage tomorrow morning? Bring your embroidery box, the one with the silver scissors." Cynthia, confused but obliging, agreed at once. "Are we going to do more detection?" she asked nervously. "Just a little observation," Miss Marple replied. "And perhaps a test." "For whom?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "For whoever stitched a murder into daffodils and didn't expect anyone to notice." ****. That night the streets of St. Mary Mead were unusually quiet. Curtains were drawn earlier than usual. The bakery had closed at 5, and Lionel Shapley was seen packing a bag through the upstairs window of his boarding room. But Miss Marple remained seated by her fireplace, staring into the soft glow of the coals, her thoughts weaving in and out like threads through linen. The pattern was nearly finished, just one final row left. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's Final Test. The morning sun cast long shadows over St. Mary Mead, gilding the rooftops in a pale gold that belied the tension curling beneath the surface. Word of Elsie Bickham's poisoning had swept through the village like a chill wind. Doors opened only a sliver. Conversations tapered off when footsteps approached. The old certainty of safety that nothing truly bad ever happened in their quaint, looming parish had been punctured. Miss Marple, as ever, began her morning quietly. She watered her snapdragons and clipped the browning petals from her peonies, before sitting down with a modest breakfast of toast and marmalade. But her eyes, usually focused on the garden's quiet drama, were fixed now on her embroidery bag. She packed it slowly and precisely. Thimble, embroidery hoop, 2 patterns, 3 spools of thread, and a long silver pen, inconspicuous among The others dot by 10 o'clock she was at Willowmere Cottage, where Inspector Cray waited at the gate, already briefed by phone. Though clearly skeptical, he'd agreed to allow Miss Marple her test. "You really believe the killer will reveal themselves with a needle and thread?" he asked. "I believe," said Miss Marple gently, "that murder, like embroidery, leaves a signature. And some signatures are harder to forge than others." Cynthia Langston arrived shortly after, embroidery box in hand, breathless but eager. "Jane, I brought everything. The scissors, even my extra floss threads. Though I don't quite understand what. All in good time, dear," Miss Marple said kindly. "Shall we go in?" Inside the drawing room, the space had been carefully rearranged. The long oak table, now cleared of any trace of Mrs. Milton's final moments, stood polished and bare. On it rested 5 needlepoint canvases, the top entries from the competition, chosen by Honoria Greystoke before the incident. A 6th canvas lay to the side, the daffodil piece found with Mrs. Milton's body. Miss Marple had requested the top. 5 contestants to arrive for a ceremonial resumption of judging. She explained to Inspector Cray that it was customary in village circles to finish what was interrupted, especially when charity and public image were involved. Honoria Greystoke arrived first, her features controlled and her mourning brooch pinned in place. "Really, Jane," she said coolly, "do we think it wise to continue this contest? In light of recent events?" "All the more reason," Miss Marple said. "Closure brings calm." Next came Eleanor Mortimer, eyeing the table with suspicion, followed by Lionel Shapley, who looked as if he hadn't slept in 2 days. Verity. Lyle arrived last, her shoulders tense beneath her shawl, her eyes darting from canvas to canvas. Miss Marple welcomed them all with tea and polite chatter. Inspector Cray stood near the doorway, his arms folded, saying little. "I thought," said Miss Marple, after everyone had gathered, "that as a way of honoring Mrs. Milton's efforts, we might ask each contestant to complete a short line on an unfinished pattern, just for demonstration." "Really?" Eleanor sniffed. "What would that accomplish?" "Consider it an exercise in style," Miss Marple said cheerfully. "Every stitcher has a rhythm, a pressure, a pace. It's rather like a fingerprint. Wouldn't you agree?" The contestants hesitated. Glancing at one another. Miss Marple unfolded a simple sampler design, just a row of ivy leaves on cream canvas. 1 line each, same thread, same needle, just a flourish. Cynthia passed the materials. Eleanor went first, her hands steady. Her stitches were tight and uniform, crisp as her disapproval. Lionel followed, clumsily pricking his thumb twice, before producing a row that was uneven and jerky. "Not much of a needleman," he muttered. "No shame in that," said Miss Marple, smiling. Verity's line was gentle and controlled smooth arcs with careful spacing. She handed the frame back quietly. And finally Honoria. She hesitated. "Miss Marple," she said slowly, "this is rather unnecessary, don't you think? But you submitted an entry, did you not?" Miss Marple replied, voice light, "Yes. But, well, I only stitch on occasion." "Even better," Miss Marple said. "The canvas is pre-marked. Just follow the pattern." Honoria pressed her lips together and took the hoop. She bent forward, and for a moment the room fell into a reverent silence, broken only by the quiet scrape of thread through cloth. When she finished, Cynthia passed it back to Miss Marple. Miss Marple didn't examine the front. She flipped it. To the back, Her eyes scanned the underside of the stitches, and she gave the faintest nod. Then she turned to Inspector Cray. "You've been patient, Inspector," she said softly, "but I believe the time has come." "Come for what, precisely?" Miss Marple turned to the room. There was a small, deliberate act committed during the murder, an attempt to complete the needlepoint with a few final stitches, sloppy ones. They were made not to win the contest, but to mislead, to delay suspicion. But those stitches were not just clumsy. They bore a very particular trait. The angle of insertion was reversed. She held up the sampler. "All 4 of you stitched, left to right with forward tension, except for one. Honoria's stitches pull from right to left. A subtle distinction, but unmistakable when compared to the stitches found on Mrs. Milton's canvas." Honoria's eyes flashed. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Miss Marple said gently, "that you were in that drawing-room before the scream, that you finished the needlepoint to make it seem Mrs. Milton had done so, and that when Elsie Bickham found something she shouldn't, your embroidered handkerchief, perhaps, you tried to silence her too." A gasp rippled through the room. Cray stepped forward. "Mrs. Greystoke, is this true?" Honoria's hands gripped the back of a chair. Her expression flickered, not panic, not denial, but something heavier. Exhausted anger. She was going to ruin everything, she said quietly. 20 years I've led this village, organized, upheld, restored. I gave these people meaning. And then she walks in with her smug city standards, judging everyone, threatening to call into question the fundraising records. Miss Marple tilted her head. "The accounts?" "She found discrepancies," Honoria said, eyes distant. "Suggested there was creative handling of prize money. I told her she misunderstood, but she said she would correct the narrative at the next Women's Guild meeting." Miss Marple gave a quiet sigh. "And you couldn't allow that?" "I thought if I could make it seem natural, quick, clean. But Elsie saw too much. And you, Miss Marple," she shook her head, "you always notice the things that shouldn't matter." Inspector Cray stepped in with a practiced firmness. "Mrs. Greystoke, I must ask you to come with me." As she was led away, the others stood in stunned silence. Only Miss Marple remained composed, her eyes falling again on the daffodil. Needlepoint, crooked, unfinished dot, and now, finally, understood. Chapter 9. The reveal and aftermath. Rain began to fall softly over St. Mary Mead the day after Honoria Greystoke's arrest, fine and steady, the kind that whispered rather than poured. It glistened on rose petals, filled the cracks between cobblestones, and blurred the edges of the world in a quiet, necessary hush. The village was still reeling. No one had spoken aloud what everyone now understood, that the woman who had presided over decades of raffles, school plays, and ladies' luncheons was capable of murder. But as Miss Marple often reflected, wickedness did not always come with warning signs. Sometimes it was tucked into the folds of virtue itself, hidden, like a loose thread no one bothered to pull until it was too late. Too late. Happened before the judging. It bought her time, suggested the crime was a sudden collapse after the fact. Cray furrowed his brow. But surely that was bound to fall apart once we examined the stitching. And yet it nearly didn't. Miss Marple said, had Elsie not seen that handkerchief, had Verity not noticed her leaving the room, Honoria might have succeeded. Most people don't know how to read the underside of a stitch. Cray chuckled dryly. "Well, I'll admit, you've given me a new appreciation for embroidery." Miss Marple smiled. As with most things in life, the truth is always in the reverse. Asterisk, asterisk, the next day dawned clear but cold. A subtle hush had returned to the village, as though the earth itself were pausing to absorb the events of the past. Week dot at Willowmere Cottage, the drawing-room stood empty and echoing. The long oak table, once set for cheerful judging and tea, now bore only a few threads of lint and a faint outline where the needlepoint frame had sat. Elsie Bickham had returned to her mother's home to recover. Honoria's belongings had been catalogued and removed. Cynthia Langston met Miss Marple by the garden gate. She had brought flowers, a mix of white peonies and lilac, and stood holding them awkwardly, unsure whether to lay them somewhere or take them home again. She made. "Everyone believed she was holding the village together," Cynthia said quietly, "but she was really holding herself above everyone else." Miss Marple nodded. "That's often the way with pride. It camouflages itself as duty, as care." "I suppose I never really liked her," Cynthia admitted, "but I always respected her. Is that strange?" "Not at all," Miss Marple said. "Respect is rarely about affection. More often it's about fear or admiration of someone's ability to impose order. Honoria was excellent at hiding her chaos beneath layers of order. That's why she chose needlepoint." Cynthia blinked. "You think the contest mattered that much to her?" Miss Marple looked down at the flower bed, where a single daffodil, out of season and slightly crooked, had begun to bloom. She had been manipulating the charity records for years, very likely skimming from event funds. Mrs. Milton, as the guest judge, had started asking uncomfortable questions. Honoria saw her position, her reputation, her narrative of perfect stewardship all threatened by a single woman who wouldn't be dazzled. The needlepoint contest wasn't the motive, it was the scene, and she tried to make it tidy, just like everything else in her life. Cynthia laid the flowers beside the daffodil, thoughtful. "And the others?" she asked. "Lionel, Eleanor, Verity, what happens to them now?" "Lionel will likely leave the village," Miss Marple said gently. "His past connection to Mrs. Milton, though innocent, will linger in whispers. Eleanor will stay, I imagine, and remind everyone daily that she would never have been so gauche as to commit murder. And Verity, I do hope she find peace. She was brave. She saw something and spoke when it counted." "She told me," Cynthia said, "that she wants to start a sewing circle. Not for competition, just companionship." Miss Marple smiled. "That sounds promising. Stitches, after all, are meant to bring things together, not tear them apart." They stood for a while in the quiet, the air fresh and clean. A bird chirped from the hedge. Somewhere down the lane a delivery cart rattled. Past Dot as Cynthia turned to go. She paused. "Will you be joining us at the village hall next week?" "I think I might," Miss Marple said. "For the embroidery?" "For the company," she replied, eyes twinkling. "Though I might bring my knitting instead, less tidy, but more forgiving." Asterisk, asterisk. That evening Miss Marple returned home and sat by her window, watching the last of the light fade behind the rooftops of St. Mary Mead. She picked up her knitting soft wool, the color of heather, and let the needles click gently in her hands. Outside, the village was returning to itself. Children played again. Windows glowed with evening light. And though the shadow of the crime still lingered faintly, It no longer ruled the air. As with all such things, it would fade folded into the fabric of memory, stitched quietly into. The long history of the village dot. Miss Marple paused, adjusted her stitch, and smiled. Dot, it was a crooked world. After all, Dot, but even crooked things could be understood. Chapter 10. A stitch in time. Dot. It was nearly a week since Honoria Greystoke had been taken from St. Mary Mead in a dark car bound for Bexhill. The world had not ended. The village, despite all predictions of permanent fracture, had begun to re-thread its familiar rhythm. Children rode bicycles again down narrow lane. The church bell rang without the sting of irony. Even the tea-room served scones again without hushed scandal. Life had resumed as it always did. Miss Marple sat in her parlor, her needles busy with a shawl in soft violet wool. Though her thoughts were elsewhere, it had taken time more than one might think to speak with everyone involved, not as a detective, but as Jane who remembered children's birthdays, and which roses bloomed earliest in which garden. Jane who could sit in a room and let silence do half the talking. It was this soft persistence, not pressure, that allowed her to do what Inspector Cray could not, understand what the murder had meant to those left behind. And, quietly, to finish the last thread of the mystery, because something had still not sat quite right. Yes, Honoria had poisoned Mrs. Milton to prevent exposure of her years of financial embellishments. Yes, she had stitched the crooked final line to buy herself time. And yes, she had acted alone in her execution of the crime. But there had been something else, a detail left unspoken, a final knot that hadn't pulled tight. The clue had been small, almost too small. A piece of blue embroidery thread. Asterisk, asterisk, it had been Verity Lyle who mentioned it again, quite innocently, over a pot of tea. "I'm glad it's over," she had said, "but I've not been able to bring myself to touch my daffodil piece since. It's silly, I know, but when I look at it I keep seeing that strange bit of blue that wasn't supposed to be there. Just a fleck. I didn't even use blue in my entry." Miss Marple, eyes sharpening behind her spectacles, had said nothing at the time. But later, in her sitting room, she had pulled out the note she'd made the day after the murder. A scrap of a detail from the scene. Blue thread on Mrs. Milton's sleeve loose frayed. It hadn't matched any of the contest entries. Not even Honoria's. So where had it come from? Asterisk, asterisk, it was that question which led her to Lionel Shapley's modest lodging. One final time, he opened the door slowly, the look in his eyes weary but expectant, as if he'd known she would return. "Miss Marple," he said quietly. "Mr. Shapley," she replied, stepping inside. "You've been packing again." He looked down at the suitcase on the floor, already half-zipped. "Thought I might go to Dorset. A cousin offered a cottage. Quiet, by the sea." Miss Marple nodded. "And the handkerchief?" He stiffened. "I assume it was yours," she continued gently. "The one Elsie found, with the embroidery pin stuck through the corner. Not something Honoria would use. Her style was harsher needlepoints with structure and flourish, not soft linen with hand-stitched initials. Yours had a gentler touch." Shapley sat down heavily. "She never intended to kill her, you know. Not originally. She just wanted to scare her off. But when she realized Mrs. Milton had already written to the guild board, it turned into something else." "She told you?" He nodded, eyes distant. "The night before the judging, We had tea. She looked desperate. I should have stopped her then. You followed her into the drawing room that day. She dropped her gloves, he said quietly. I meant to return them. I thought. She was alone, but then I saw the body. I panicked. I tried to finish the needlepoint she had told me once that precision mattered. I thought if I made it look clean tidy, people might not think of her as capable of something so messy. Miss. Marple was silent for a long moment. And the blue thread? I stitched a single knot, he said. Just one. Then I realized I couldn't match the tension. It looked wrong. I left. I didn't know about the poison until later. When she confessed, I thought, perhaps I should keep quiet. You feared being accused as well. I feared she'd be remembered only for the crime, he said, not for the care she gave to this village, for the way she made lonely people feel like they belonged. Miss Marple looked at him kindly. And yet, you see, Mr. Shapley, it is not by hiding the flaws that we honor the person. It is by understanding them. He looked away, his jaw trembling. I don't believe you intended to deceive, she said softly. And I suspect Cray, once told the full story, will agree. But the truth must be sewn into the fabric before it unravels on its own. He nodded. I'll speak to him. She rose, reaching gently for the door. A stitch in time, Mr. Shapley. Not to save punishment, but to mend the truth. Asterisk, asterisk. The following day the vicar announced that Willowmere Cottage would remain empty. For a season. Honoria's remaining possessions were boxed and sent to her niece in Kent. The embroidery circle resumed, this time held in the schoolroom, with Verity Lyle as its new organizer. There would be no competition this year, only companionship and calm threads. Inspector Cray, after hearing Lionel's confession, agreed not to press charges. Accessory by conscience, not by crime, he said, shaking his head. That man punished himself harder than the law ever could. Miss Marple, meanwhile, returned to her knitting. She had never been fond of needlepoint, despite her appreciation for its clues. Knitting was more forgiving, she often said. It allowed for small mistakes, then showed you how to correct them, if you only paid attention. That evening she visited the churchyard alone. She carried a simple bunch of white flowers tied with blue thread. She knelt at a fresh stone, unmarked as yet, and laid the bouquet down. For the woman you were, she murmured, and the woman you tried to be. As she stood, the bells chimed softly in the tower above. The air was still. The village behind her quiet dot, Miss Marple turned and walked home through the dusk. Her steps unhurried, her heart full not of triumph, but of peace. The case of the crooked needlepoint had been solved, and the last stitch finally held.